Garrett Calloway measured his days by the distance between sunup and sundown, marked only by the tending of the few scrawny cattle that scratched a living from the parched Wyoming earth. The year was 1884, and his small cabin, listing slightly on its foundation, felt less like a home and more like a scar on the vast, indifferent face of the land. He was alone, a fact as constant as the wind that worried the corners of the cabin and sighed through the sparse pines on the ridge. Loneliness clung to him like the dust. A fine layer settled over his life since Martha and the baby had gone, swallowed by the fever 3 winters ago. He wasn't thriving. He wasn't even sure he was truly living. Survival was a chore, a grim routine of chopping wood, mending fences, and trying to coax sustenance from soil that seemed determined to yield nothing but rocks and stubborn scrub brush. He had come west with hope, like so many others, but the frontier had a way of grinding hope down, leaving behind a gritty residue of endurance. He was hardened, yes, but the hardness was brittle around the edges, a thin shell over a hollow core. He avoided the nearest settlement, Fort Laramie, unless absolutely necessary. The pity in their eyes, the casual questions about Martha, the clatter of lives still connected, it was all too much. Isolation was safer, less painful. One afternoon, chasing a stray calf near the creek bed that was more dust than water this late in the season, he saw something out of place, a splash of dark fabric against the muted browns and grays of the landscape. He approached cautiously, hand hovering near the worn butt of his colt. Trouble out here usually rode in on 2 legs, often hostile. It wasn't trouble in the way he expected. It was a woman, young, lying still in the shallow depression of the creek bed. Her clothing was traditional, worn leather and cloth, intricately beaded, Comanche. Fear, sharp and cold, pricked at him. Comanche weren't often seen this far south anymore, not openly. There had been clashes, stories of raids, though mostly farther north or west. He had heard them whispered in Laramie, adding another layer to the general unease of the territory. But as he knelt, the fear was quickly replaced by a surge of something else, a stark, immediate recognition of vulnerability. She was badly wounded. A deep gash across her upper arm seeped dark blood into the dust, and another, uglier wound marred her side. Her breath was shallow, ragged. Her eyes, when they fluttered open, were dark pools of pain and confusion, but held no aggression, only a raw, animal fear. He couldn't leave her. The thought was instantaneous, bypassing the ingrained caution and the societal prejudice that painted all Comanche as threats. This wasn't a warrior, not a raiding party. This was a girl, maybe 18, dying in the dirt. The memory of Martha, helpless and burning with fever, flashed behind his eyes. The powerlessness, the desperate need to do something. "Easy," he murmured, his voice rough with disuse. He didn't know if she understood English, likely not, but the tone was meant to be gentle. He ripped a strip from his bandana and pressed it clumsily to her arm wound. She flinched, a small whimper escaping her lips. Getting her back to the cabin was a struggle. She was light, but every movement clearly sent agony through her. He half carried, half dragged her, his arms aching, his mind racing. What was he doing, harboring a Comanche? If anyone from Laramie found out, if her people found out. He got her inside the cabin, the one room suddenly feeling cramped and exposed. He laid her gently on his narrow cot. The side wound was bad, likely a glancing bullet or a deep cut. It needed cleaning, stitching if he knew how, which he didn't. All he had was lukewarm water from the well, a bottle of questionable whiskey, and some old rags. He worked as best he could, his movements awkward but careful. He poured whiskey on the wounds, ignoring her sharp cry, knowing the sting was necessary. He cleaned away the blood and dirt, his stomach clenching at the sight. He bound the wounds tightly with strips of clean flour sacking. She watched him the whole time, her eyes wide, tracking his every move, still filled with fear, but something else too, a hesitant curiosity perhaps. He gave her water, holding the cup to her lips. She drank greedily, her throat working. He found a few dried strips of venison jerky, crumbled them, and offered them. She chewed slowly, watching him. They existed in the cabin, hour after hour, in a profound silence broken only by her ragged breathing and the occasional creak of the old structure. Garrett sat on the floor across from her cot, cleaning his rifle, stealing glances at her. She slept fitfully, murmuring in her language. When she was awake, she was still observant. There was a quiet strength about her, even in her weakened state, a dignity that the rough clothing and dirt couldn't hide. He didn't ask who she was, how she got there. Words were useless. All that mattered was the immediate need, keeping her alive. He ate his meager supper of beans cold from the pot. He didn't offer her any. Jerky was probably better for her stomach anyway. The lamp cast long, dancing shadows. Outside, the wind howled like a thing grieving, pressing against the thin walls. Inside, the silence was different, shared, heavier than his usual solitude. He felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, not hope, not peace, but a faint lessening of the absolute emptiness that had defined his days. He had a purpose, however temporary. The next morning she was awake. Her eyes followed him as he stoked the fire and put on the coffee pot. He saw her wince as she tried to shift. The fever had broken, he thought, but she was still weak. He boiled water and cleaned her wounds again, gentler this time. She didn't cry out, only clenched her jaw, her dark eyes steady on his. He managed a few words, slow and careful. "Garrett," he said, tapping his chest. "Garrett?" She watched him, then, after a long moment, touched her own chest lightly. A soft sound, a name. "Nahili," he thought she said. It sounded like the wind in tall grass. "Nahili," he repeated. A small ghost of a smile touched her lips, quick and fleeting. It was the first softening he had seen, a tiny crack in the wall of her fear and pain. He felt a warmth spread in his chest, unexpected and unsettling. He was outside feeding the chickens, a handful of scrawny birds, his last link to a semblance of normalcy, when he heard it. The drumming of hooves on the hard earth, not one horse or two, many. A rumble that grew quickly into a thunderous roar. He dropped the feed pail, his heart leaping into his throat. Raiders? But they were riding fast, straight towards his cabin. He scrambled for his rifle, leaning against the cabin wall. There was no time to run, nowhere to go. Then they crested the rise. 30, maybe more, mounted warriors, their faces painted, feathers streaming, lances and rifles held ready. At the front rode an older man, his face etched with authority, his bearing regal despite the dust. Garrett recognized the look of a chief. They pulled their horses to a halt 20 yards from the cabin, a formidable, silent line against the skyline. The chief dismounted, his movements deliberate. Another warrior, younger, with shrewd eyes, dismounted with him. The rest remained mounted, still and watchful, their presence radiating a quiet, potent power. Garrett stood frozen, rifle gripped tightly, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. His mind screamed at him. Run, hide, fight. But his feet were rooted to the spot. 30 warriors. He was a dead man. The chief walked towards him slowly, the younger warrior a step behind. They stopped a few paces away, their gaze unwavering. Garrett could feel the eyes of all 30 warriors on him, sharp and assessing. The chief spoke, his voice deep and resonant, the words in Comanche. Garrett understood nothing. He swallowed, trying to find his voice. I don't understand you," he managed, his voice trembling slightly. The younger warrior stepped forward. He spoke in surprisingly good, though heavily accented, English. "He has many horses, chief of the Scattered Rocks band, he says. He asks why you hide his daughter." Garrett's blood ran cold. His daughter, Nahili. He hadn't been hiding her. He had been helping her. "She was hurt," Garrett said quickly. "Badly hurt. I found her by the creek. I brought her here to tend her wounds. She's inside." Many horses listened to the translation, his expression unreadable. He nodded slowly, then spoke again. The younger warrior translated. "He says, he saw the trail. You brought her here. He thanks you for not leaving her to the buzzards." A flicker of surprise went through Garrett. Thanks? He had expected anger, maybe vengeance. Many horses spoke again, longer this time. The younger warrior listened intently, then turned back to Garrett, his expression serious. "My chief says, you have touched his daughter. You have brought her into your lodge, among our people. This creates an obligation, a bond." Garrett felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Obligation? Bond? What was he talking about? The younger warrior continued, his gaze steady. "He says, you have cared for her, You have seen her helplessness, you have offered her your protection, in our way. This means you claim her." Garrett shook his head, bewildered. "Claim her? No, I just helped her. She was hurt." Many Horses spoke, his voice sharp now, leaving no room for argument. The younger warrior translated, his eyes holding a touch of sympathy, or maybe just understanding. "My chief says, your ways are strange, our ways are clear. You have brought her into your lodge, you have seen her body, cared for her. She is no longer just our daughter, she is intertwined with your life now," he says. "There is only one path forward that brings honor to all," he says. "You will marry her." The words hung in the air, heavier than the dust. Marry her? Marry a woman he had found wounded by the creek, a woman he barely knew, a Comanche, a stranger? His mind reeled. It was preposterous. Impossible. He couldn't. But he looked past the warrior translator to Many Horses, to the silent, imposing line of warriors on their horses, the sheer, undeniable force they represented. He was one man, alone in a rickety cabin. They were 30 seasoned fighters, led by a chief whose word was law. There was no negotiation, there was no escape. Marry her. The alternative was clear in the chief's unyielding gaze, in the quiet readiness of the warriors. Refusal meant death, and not just his own, likely. He remembered the look in Nahili's eyes, the soft sound of her name on her lips. He had brought her into his care. Was he to abandon her now to whatever fate awaited her if the chief decided his actions were an insult? His gaze flicked back to the cabin door. Nahili was inside, vulnerable. He had, perhaps inadvertently, taken responsibility for her the moment he knelt by her side. And now, her father was here to enforce that responsibility, according to his laws. "Marry her," the warrior repeated, the words a pronouncement, not a question. Garrett looked at the chief, then back at the line of warriors. He felt a strange, detached calm settle over him. The lonely life he had been leading, the slow, painful decay of his existence. What was there to cling to? Nothing. And here, suddenly, was a path, brutal and unwanted, but a path nonetheless. It wasn't the path he would have chosen, but it was the only one offered. He lowered his rifle slowly, letting it hang loosely in his hand. He looked at Many Horses, nodding. "All right," Garrett said, his voice low but steady. "All right. I'll marry her." The warrior translated. Many Horses watched him for another long moment, then gave a single, sharp nod. He spoke again, and the warrior translated. He says, "It is done. We will witness this. You will make your vows in the sight of the Great Spirit and your own God." It wasn't a ceremony in any way Garrett understood it. Many Horses, the younger warrior, whose name Garrett learned was Tala, Garrett, and a few other senior warriors gathered near the cabin. Nahili, pale but steady, was brought out. She looked at Garrett, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and resignation. He couldn't read her feelings about this sudden turn of events. Many Horses spoke at length in Comanche, a solemn address. Tala translated the essential points. Garrett had saved Nahili, brought her here, and now claimed her as his wife according to their customs. He swore Garrett to protect her, to provide for her, to honor her as his woman. Garrett, feeling entirely unreal, repeated the vows translated by Tala, his voice a monotone. He spoke of respect and protection, the only honest things he could offer in that moment. Nahili, in turn, spoke softly in her own language, making her vows, which Tala translated as promising loyalty and partnership. There was no ring, no Bible, only the stark pronouncements, the witnesses of the warriors, the vast sky overhead. It was a binding, not of love or desire, but of circumstance and custom. A strange, sudden grafting of two entirely separate lives and cultures. When it was over, Many Horses spoke to Nahili, a long, tender speech that Garrett couldn't understand, but recognized as a father's words to his daughter. He touched her cheek, his gaze filled with a pride and sorrow that transcended language. Then, with another sharp nod to Garrett, acknowledging the new, complex relationship between them, Many Horses mounted his horse. The warriors turned as one, a ripple of movement through the gathered horses. Many Horses led the way, and the 30 warriors followed, riding back the way they had come, disappearing over the rise as quickly as they had appeared. The thunder of their hooves faded, leaving behind an echoing silence that was even deeper than before. Garrett stood there for a long time, watching the empty horizon. Beside him, Nahili stood quietly, her face averted. He was married. To her. A stranger. A Comanche woman. His life, which had been stagnant and empty, was now violently, irrevocably changed. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time as his wife. She was still pale, still favoring her side, but she stood tall, her gaze fixed on the distant ridge where her people had vanished. He cleared his throat. "Well," he said, the words sounding clumsy and inadequate. Guess we're married." She turned her head slowly, her dark eyes meeting his. She didn't speak, but in her gaze, he saw not fear now, but a weary acceptance, a quiet question. What now? What now, indeed? The cabin felt smaller, the silence between them vast. They were two planets, suddenly bound by an invisible, unbreakable chain, orbiting each other in the suffocating quiet. The first few weeks were a study in awkward cohabitation. They shared the small cabin, but not much else. Garrett slept on the floor, giving her the cot. He went about his chores, the cattle, the fences, the endless struggle against the land, much as he always had. Nahili, still recovering from her wounds, mostly stayed inside. She moved with a quiet grace, observing him, the cabin, the alien world she had been thrust into. Communication was a monumental hurdle. A few shared words, water, fire, food, were painstakingly learned, supplemented by gestures and pointing. It was like building a bridge one small stone at a time across a chasm. There was subtext in everything: the way he handed her a plate, the way she folded a blanket, the careful avoidance of direct touch. He learned small things about her without words. She was meticulous, keeping the cabin tidier than he ever had. She had a quiet strength, enduring the pain of her wounds without complaint. Her hands, despite her background, were deft and capable. She could mend cloth with surprising skill. He saw the loneliness in her eyes sometimes, the longing for her people, her home. It mirrored his own, a shared solitude even when they were in the same room. Prejudice wasn't just an external force, it was an internal one too. Garrett had grown up hearing the stories, the fears. He wrestled with the ingrained suspicion, the automatic labeling. But living with her, seeing her quiet grace, her vulnerability, her simple humanity, chipped away at the walls he had built. She wasn't the savage of the stories. She was just Nahili, a woman far from home, wounded and alone, just as he was. One evening, a fierce storm blew in, rattling the cabin, the wind screaming like a banshee. The rain lashed against the windows, threatening to tear the roof off. Garrett worked to brace the door, the old wood groaning. A particularly violent gust hit, and the cabin shuddered. Garrett stumbled back. Before he could react, Nahili was there, her eyes wide with alarm. Without hesitation, she threw her weight against the door beside him, her small frame surprisingly solid. They stood together, shoulder to shoulder, bracing against the storm's fury, the wind and rain a chaotic world outside, the small cabin a fragile bubble of shared effort inside. When the worst of it passed, they slowly released the door. Garrett looked at her, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. A shared victory, small as it was. Shared experiences, born of necessity, began to wear down the barriers. She helped him sometimes, carrying water from the well despite his initial protests, gathering dry kindling. He, in turn, learned to watch for her needs, anticipating when she needed water or warmth. He found himself explaining things to her, simple things like how the pump worked or why the cattle were behaving a certain way, even though he knew she only understood a fraction of the words. It was the act of sharing his world, an unconscious offering. One cold morning, he woke to find her sitting by the fire, wrapping strips of buffalo hide around her injured arm, reinforcing the bandage he had applied. It was a technique he didn't recognize. He watched her, fascinated by the intricate, practical way she worked the leather. When she was finished, she looked up and met his gaze. She held out her arm, indicating the bandage. "Good," she said, the English word clear and soft. He nodded, a genuine smile touching his lips. "Good," he agreed, "strong." Another time, he brought down a deer. He had always butchered it quickly, efficiently. Nahili came outside and watched him. Then she gestured, making a cutting motion on the hide, pointing to different parts of the animal. He realized she was showing him how to utilize more of the animal, how to prepare the hide, how to preserve meat in ways he hadn't known. Hesitantly, he followed her silent instructions, learning from her quiet expertise. It was humbling, and it deepened his respect for her. She was not helpless. She possessed knowledge vital for survival in this harsh land, knowledge that had been passed down through generations. The quiet in the cabin began to change. It was no longer an empty, aching silence, but a companionable one. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, he cleaning his gear, she working on some intricate beadwork she had salvaged or making repairs to her clothing. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the wind outside, and the soft, rhythmic movements of their hands. One night she spoke, her voice hesitant. "Your woman," she said, looking at a faded photograph on a small shelf, "Martha." "Gone." Garrett froze. It was the most complex English sentence she had put together. He looked at the photo, a pang of familiar grief tightening his chest. He nodded, his throat thick. "Gone," he managed. "Fever, and our baby, gone too." Her eyes were full of understanding, ancient sorrow reflected there. She reached out a hand, tentative, and touched his arm lightly. Her touch was warm, brief. A simple gesture, but it reached across the vast distance between them, across the cultures and the pain. He looked at her, startled by the depth of empathy in her gaze. For the first time since Martha died, he didn't feel utterly alone with his grief. They talked more after that, the words slow and halting, a mixture of English, Comanche words she taught him, and gestures. They spoke of families, of loss, of the land. He learned about her band, about the conflicts that had scattered them, about the attack that had left her wounded and alone. She learned about his life before the West, his failed dreams, the emptiness that had followed Martha's death. They were two damaged souls, finding hesitant solace in each other's unexpected presence. The forced marriage, the thing that had seemed an impossible burden, was slowly transforming into something else. It wasn't love, not the kind he had known with Martha, not yet. It was something quieter, deeper, a mutual respect, a shared vulnerability, a profound sense of companionship born from shared hardship and unexpected kindness. He had saved her life, and in doing so, he had inadvertently saved his own from a slow, silent decay. She had been forced into his life, and in adapting, in simply being with him, she was helping him heal. One afternoon, riding the fence line farther than usual, he encountered some men from the settlement. They were passing through, looking for stray cattle. They saw him. Then they saw Nahili near the cabin, hanging laundry he hadn't realized she'd washed. Their faces hardened. Calloway, the biggest one, a man named Brody, spat, reining in his horse. His eyes were narrow with suspicion and open disapproval. "What in God's name do you think you're doing keeping an Injun woman?" Garrett felt a surge of anger, hot and protective. He wasn't the man who would have avoided confrontation a few months ago. He was different now. "She's my wife," he said, his voice steady, meeting Brody's hostile gaze. Brody actually laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Your wife? Calloway, you gone simple? You can't marry them kind. It ain't legal, and it ain't decent." The other men muttered in agreement, their eyes lingering on Nahili with contempt. "Legal or not," Garrett said, pushing his horse forward slightly, putting himself between them and the cabin, "she's with me. She was hurt. I helped her. Her father came, and we married according to their way. That's enough for me." Brody's face darkened. "Their way? You think that makes it right? She's a savage. You know what they do." "I know what she did," Garrett countered, his voice rising slightly. "She was dying, and I brought her in. You'd have left her. You want trouble, Brody? Because you're looking at my wife, and you're on my land." The challenge hung in the air. Brody hesitated, glancing at the cabin, then back at Garrett. Garrett Calloway hadn't been much of a threat before, a quiet, broken man. But the man standing before him now had a different look in his eyes, a quiet intensity, a willingness to stand his ground. And while they might outnumber him, they weren't looking for a gunfight over a savage woman on a struggling ranch. Brody grunted, disgusted. "You're a fool, Calloway. Mark my words, no good will come of this." He spat on the ground and wheeled his horse around. "Let's go." "Ain't worth the bother." They rode away, leaving Garrett trembling slightly with adrenaline. He watched them go, then turned his horse back towards the cabin. Nahili was standing by the clothesline, watching him, her expression unreadable. He rode up to her, dismounted, and walked over. "You all right?" he asked, the question simple but loaded. She nodded slowly. "Here." "They were just ignorant," he said, shrugging. "Doesn't matter what they think." She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She reached out again, this time taking his hand in hers. Her grip was firm. "My man," she said, articulating the words carefully, deliberately, "you protect." The simple declaration, the touch of her hand, sent a shock through him. "My man, you protect." It wasn't the forced vow from the ceremony, it was a statement of earned trust, of recognition. He looked at her, at the woman who had been thrust into his life by fate and her father's decree, and felt a profound connection he hadn't expected, hadn't dared to hope for. Months turned into a year, the seasons changed, the land endured, their life together settled into a rhythm. The language barrier lessened, becoming less of a wall and more of a shared challenge, a source of occasional, gentle amusement. They learned to laugh together, tentatively at first, then more freely. Garrett learned her stories, the rich history of her people, their deep connection to the land he had only ever seen as a struggle. She taught him to see the subtle signs in nature, the wisdom of the old ways. He, in turn, shared his world, his practical skills, his quiet resilience forged in a different kind of hardship. The cabin, once a place of lonely emptiness, was now filled with a quiet warmth. Her beadwork added splashes of color. Her presence filled the silence that had once been suffocating. It wasn't the life he had planned, not the wife he had expected, but it was their life, built together, stone by slow stone, on a foundation of unexpected circumstance and mutual need. The forced marriage had been a cruel twist of fate, born from the clash of cultures and the harsh realities of the frontier. But from that unlikely, unwelcome beginning, something genuine had grown. He had found not just a companion, but a partner. He had protected her, and in doing so, he had found his own strength again. He was no longer defined by his loss, his isolation. He was Garrett, Nahili's husband, a man who had faced down prejudice and fear, and found belonging where he least expected it. His struggle with the land hadn't ended, that was a constant. But he wasn't struggling alone anymore. When the wind howled outside, it no longer sounded like grief. It was just the wind. And inside there was fire, warmth, and the quiet presence of the woman who had been delivered to his doorstep by fate and 30 warriors, and who had, against all odds, become his home. The frontier was still harsh, still indifferent, but in their small cabin, two souls, so different and so alone, had found each other, proving that sometimes the most profound connections are forged in the most unexpected and challenging fires. Their story was not one for the ballads of romance, but a testament to resilience, the quiet power of kindness, and the strange, beautiful ways people find their way home.
The year was 1884, and the wind across the Dakota plains had a voice. It was not a gentle whisper, it was a mournful cry that scoured the land, stripping the color from the grass and leaving behind a brittle, dun-colored memory of summer. For Isaac Prescott, the wind was just another form of silence. It filled the spaces that his own thoughts could not, a constant, keening companion in the vast emptiness he called home. His ranch was a lonely outpost, a handful of sturdy buildings huddled against the immense, indifferent sky. He had built the cabin with his own 2 hands, for a life that had vanished before it had truly begun. Isaac's days were carved into a rigid routine, a bulwark against the tide of memory that threatened to pull him under. He rose before the sun painted the eastern horizon, his movements precise and economical. He mended fences that bordered nothing but more emptiness, his hammer blows a stark punctuation in the quiet. He tended to his small herd of cattle, their lowing the only conversation he held most days. He chopped wood until his shoulders ached, the clean, sharp scent of pine a welcome distraction. Each task was a stone laid upon a grave, a deliberate act of forgetting, but grief was a persistent phantom. It sat with him at his supper table, a vacant space where his wife, Mary, should have been. It echoed in the profound stillness of the bedroom, where the cradle he had sanded smooth stood empty. 2 years. 2 years since he had buried both his wife and their newborn son on the same bleak afternoon. the raw earth a wound in the prairie. He had become a man made of edges and silence, his heart a locked room whose key he had long since thrown away. He moved through his life like a ghost, his own presence barely registering. The man who had once laughed easily, whose blue eyes had held a spark of boundless optimism, was gone. In his place was this hardened shell, a man who spoke only when necessary and felt even less. The isolation was a kind of penance, a self-imposed exile. He wanted nothing, asked for nothing, and expected nothing. The land was harsh, demanding, and in its unforgiving nature, he found a strange sort of comfort. It did not offer false hope or easy solace. It simply was, vast and immutable, a mirror to the desolation within him. One morning in late October, the world woke up wrong. A cold front had swept down from the north with unnatural speed, bringing with it a biting, wet snow that was weeks too early. The flakes were thick and heavy, clinging to the branches of the few scraggly cottonwoods and blurring the sharp lines of the horizon. It was a treacherous snow, the kind that could trap and kill a man or his livestock if they were caught unprepared. A deep unease settled in Isaac's gut as he pulled on his heaviest coat. He had a fence line miles to the west that ran alongside a series of rocky outcrops, a place where cattle could get foolishly trapped in a sudden storm. Leaving it to chance was not in his nature. He saddled his steady gelding, Old Bill, the horse's breath pluming in the frigid air. The world was a swirl of white and grey, the wind driving the snow into his face with stinging force. It was a fool's errand, he knew, but the routine was all he had. For hours he rode, leaning into the wind, his world shrinking to the space between his horse's ears. He was nearing the outcrops, the dark slash of rock barely visible through the curtain of snow, when Old Bill suddenly shied, snorting and tossing his head. The horse was not prone to spooking. Isaac pulled him to a halt, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle in his saddle scabbard. He strained his eyes, peering into the maelstrom. At first, he thought it was a wounded animal, a dark shape huddled at the base of the rocks, a pathetic mound against the rising drifts. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the wet, heavy snow. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a person, a woman, cloaked in worn hides, her black hair matted with snow. She was collapsed, almost entirely buried, her body a fragile shield over something else. He saw a flicker of movement, a tiny, twitching motion from beneath her. He reached her in a few long strides, his heart hammering against his ribs with an unfamiliar urgency. He knelt, his knees sinking into the freezing ground. The woman's face was ashen, her lips a faint, bluish purple. Her eyes were closed, her breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. She was Lakota, that much was clear from her garments and the lines of her face, but she was impossibly far from any known encampment. As he gently tried to move her, a low moan escaped her lips, a sound of profound agony and despair. It was then he saw what she was protecting. Tucked into the curve of her body, wrapped in layers of rabbit fur and buckskin, were two infants. They were terrifyingly small, their faces pinched and pale. They were not crying, they were not moving. A cold dread, sharper than the wind, pierced through Isaac's layers of detachment. He had seen death too many times. He touched one tiny cheek. It was colder than the snow. For a long moment, he was paralyzed. The sheer, desperate tragedy of the scene rooted him to the spot. This woman and her children were dying. The prairie was claiming them, as it claimed everything eventually. The old Isaac, the man he was before, would have recoiled from this, would have seen it as the will of a cruel god. The current Isaac, the man of routine and stone, felt the instinct to turn away, to ride back to the shelter of his silent cabin and let the storm finish its work. It was not his concern. It was not his grief to bear. But as he looked at the woman's face, at the fierce, unconscious instinct that made her curl her freezing body around her young, something cracked open inside him. He saw not a stranger, not an Indian, but a mother. It was an image that sliced through his defenses with the precision of a surgeon's blade, laying bare the wound he kept so carefully hidden. He saw Mary's face in his mind, pale and exhausted after her own labor. He saw the small, still form of his son. A sound tore from his own throat, a raw curse against the wind and the sky and the whole damned, empty world. He could not leave them. He could not be the kind of man who rode away from this. That man, at least, was not dead. With a surge of desperate energy, he began to work. He gently disentangled the infants from their mother's arms. They were impossibly light. He unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat, pulling it open to the biting wind. He placed the two small bundles against his own chest, against the warmth of his body, and buttoned the coat over them. He then turned back to the woman. She was a dead weight, but fueled by a sudden, fierce adrenaline, he managed to lift her, draping her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. The journey back was a waking nightmare. Every step was a battle against the wind and the deepening snow. The woman's weight was a crushing burden, and the fragile lives against his chest were a terrifying responsibility. He spoke to them, his voice rough and strange in the howling gale. "Hold on," he muttered, the words snatched away by the wind. "Just hold on." He spoke to the horse, to the woman, to the babies, to the ghost of his wife. It was a prayer, a promise, a frantic plea against the encroaching silence. When he finally stumbled into his own yard, the lights of his cabin, a beacon in the swirling dark, he was not sure if any of them, including himself, were still alive. He half-carried, half-dragged the woman inside, laying her on the rag rug before the cold hearth. He did not have the strength to get her to the bed. He stripped off his coat and gently laid the two infants on his own cot, their stillness a terrifying accusation. He worked with a grim, focused intensity that banished all thought. He built a fire, the flames catching quickly, greedily, and beginning to push back the bone-deep chill in the room. He stripped the woman of her wet, frozen hides, his movements clinical, impersonal. Her body was thin, her ribs stark beneath the skin, but she was alive. He wrapped her in every spare blanket he owned and propped her head on a pillow. Then he turned to the babies. He was clumsy, his large, calloused hands shaking as he unwrapped them. They were a boy and a girl, twins, so small they looked like porcelain dolls. Their skin was mottled and cold, but as the warmth of the cabin began to seep into them, he saw a faint flush of color return. He found a soft, old flannel shirt of Mary's tucked away in a chest, a relic he had not been able to part with. The scent of lavender and cedar rose from the fabric, a ghostly perfume that struck him like a physical blow. He tore the shirt into strips, his vision blurring. He used the soft cloth to gently, methodically, rub warmth back into their tiny limbs. He worked for what felt like hours, his world shrinking to this single, desperate task. He heated some cow's milk, thinning it with boiled water, just as the doctor had instructed him for his own son. He dipped a corner of a clean rag into the warm liquid and squeezed a few drops into the boy's mouth. The baby coughed, sputtered, and then, miraculously, began to suckle weakly. A cry, thin and reedy as a bird's call, broke the silence. It was the most beautiful sound Isaac had ever heard. He turned to the girl and did the same. She, too, responded, her own small cry joining her brother's. The cabin, so long a tomb of silence, was suddenly, shockingly, filled with the sound of life. Isaac sank back on his heels, a wave of exhaustion and relief so profound it almost buckled him. He had done it. They were alive. He looked from the squirming, crying infants to their mother, who was now stirring by the fire. Her eyes fluttered open. They were dark and deep, and for a moment they were filled with a terrifying, wild panic. Her gaze darted around the strange room, landing on him, a white man, and then on her children, lying on his bed. A look of pure, animal terror crossed her face. "Easy now," Isaac said, his voice low and calm, holding up his hands to show they were empty. "You're safe. Your children are safe." Her eyes narrowed. They were filled with a suspicion as deep and cold as the storm outside. She did not trust him. He did not expect her to. He just watched her, a silent guardian, as the fire crackled and the twins cried, and the world outside the cabin windows slowly vanished into a fury of white. In the flickering firelight, he got his first proper look at the infants. He gently wiped the boy's face with a damp corner of the cloth. The baby blinked, his little fists uncurling. And Isaac Prescott froze. Staring back at him, wide and impossibly clear in the small, wrinkled face, were two eyes the color of a summer sky. They were a startling, piercing blue, the exact shade of blue as his own. The exact shade of blue as his lost Mary's. The sight was so unexpected, so impossible, it felt like a punch to the gut. He looked from the boy to the girl. Her eyes, too, were the same brilliant, shocking blue. He stared at them, then at their dark-haired, dark-eyed mother lying by the fire, and 1,000 questions, none of which had an answer, crashed down upon him. The lonely cowboy who had found them saw his own blue eyes staring back, and the silence in his heart was shattered forever. The first days were a delicate, silent truce. The woman, whose name he did not know, recovered slowly. She was weakened by childbirth and starvation, and she spent most of her time sleeping by the hearth, a fitful, haunted sleep. When she was awake, she watched him. Her gaze was a tangible thing, a weight in the small cabin. It was a look of profound distrust, sharp and wary as a cornered wolf's. Isaac understood it. In her world, a man with his face was a threat, a harbinger of violence and loss. Kindness from such a man was more suspect than cruelty. He kept his distance, moving with a quiet purpose that he hoped was reassuring. His words were few and strictly functional. "There's broth on the stove," he'd say, leaving a bowl on a crate near her blankets. "The milk is warm for the babes." He never approached her directly unless necessary, never made a sudden move. He was the caretaker of the space, the provider of warmth and food, but she was the silent, watchful queen of her small territory by the fire. Caring for the twins consumed him. It was an awkward, fumbling process. His large, rough hands, so accustomed to the heft of an axe or the reins of a horse, struggled with the delicate task of swaddling and feeding. He felt like a clumsy giant tending to fragile sparrows. Yet, in this clumsiness, he found a strange sort of grace. The simple, overwhelming needs of the infants forced him out of the prison of his own mind. He could not dwell on his own loss when a tiny mouth was searching for sustenance, when a thin cry pierced the air demanding comfort. The blue eyes of the twins were a constant, unnerving miracle. Every time he looked at them, he felt a jolt, a painful echo of Mary. It was a ghost in his house, a memory made flesh. He found himself talking to them in low murmurs as he worked, the way he had once talked to the swell of Mary's belly. "There now, little man," he'd whisper to the boy. "Settle down, little miss," he'd coo at the girl. It was a conversation with the past, with the future he'd been denied, and it was slowly, imperceptibly, prying open the locked rooms of his heart. After 4 days, the woman finally sat up on her own. She was still weak, but a flicker of strength had returned to her dark eyes. She watched as Isaac clumsily tried to change one of the babies, who was wailing with indignation. Without a word, she pushed her blankets aside and rose unsteadily to her feet. She walked over to the cot, her movements stiff but resolute. She held out her hands. Isaac hesitated for a fraction of a second, then carefully handed the crying infant to her. The moment the baby was in her arms, he fell silent. She held him with an innate, effortless confidence that Isaac could only envy. Her hands, though thin, were sure and gentle. She murmured something to the child in her own language, a soft, flowing sound like water over stones. It was the first time he had heard her voice used for anything other than a moan of pain. From that moment, a subtle shift occurred. She took over the primary care of the children. It was her right, her purpose. A silent understanding passed between them. He would provide the food, the shelter, the wood for the fire. She would nurture. The cabin, which had been his solitary domain, now had two distinct spheres of influence. His was the world of iron and wood, of the outdoors. Hers was the world of warmth and flesh, of the hearth and the cradle he had moved near the fire. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer the heavy, suspicious silence of the first few days. It became a shared quiet, a space they inhabited together. They ate their meals at the small table, the sound of their utensils and the gurgling of the babies, the only noise. Isaac found himself watching her, the efficient grace of her movements, the fierce, protective love in her eyes, whenever she looked at her children. He saw a strength in her that humbled him, a resilience forged in a fire he could scarcely imagine. One evening, as the wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, one of the babies, the boy, began to cry with a feverish, distressed wail. His small body was hot to the touch, and his breathing was shallow. A familiar, cold fear seized Isaac. He saw his own son, his skin flushed with the fever that had ultimately taken him. The woman looked up at him, her face a mask of controlled panic. In that moment, they were not a white man and an Indian woman. They were two parents, terrified for their child. All night, they worked together. He kept the fire roaring, boiled water, and brought cool cloths. She held the baby, sponging his small body, murmuring her soft, constant lullabies. They moved around each other in a seamless, unspoken dance. They were a team, united against the specter of death that hovered in the room. Towards dawn, the fever broke. The boy's breathing eased, and he fell into a deep, healing sleep. The woman sagged with relief, her head bowed over her son. Isaac brought her a mug of hot, sweet coffee. She took it, her fingers brushing his. It was the first time they had touched. Her eyes met his over the rim of the mug, and for the first time, the suspicion was gone. In its place was a flicker of something else, gratitude, a shared understanding. "He is strong," Isaac said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. She nodded, her gaze returning to her son. After a long moment of silence, she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Winona." Isaac blinked. "I'm sorry?" "My name," she said, looking at him again. "It is Winona." It was an offering, a bridge across the chasm that had separated them. "Isaac," he replied, the name feeling strange on his own lips. "My name is Isaac." That night, something fundamental was settled between them. The next evening, as she nursed the little girl, she spoke again. Her English was hesitant, learned from traders and the reservation school she had attended as a child, but her meaning was clear. She told him why she had been out in the storm. She had been cast out by her people, the Lakota. To give birth to twins was rare, sometimes seen as a powerful blessing, but sometimes as a dangerous imbalance. To give birth to twins with the pale skin and sky-colored eyes of the white man was a curse, an undeniable sign of impurity, of a tainted spirit. "My grandmother's mother," she explained, her voice low. "She was taken in a raid, a white woman with hair like the sun. The old one said her blood was forgotten. But it was only sleeping. Her people, steeped in fear and tradition, and swayed by a rival who had wanted her for his own, saw the babies as an ill omen, a violation of their bloodlines. They had not killed her outright. Instead, they had performed the crueler ritual of abandonment, leaving her and her unnatural offspring to the judgment of the spirits and the unforgiving prairie. Isaac listened, a cold anger building in his chest. He looked at the perfect, tiny infant in Winona's arms, then at her brother sleeping peacefully. A curse? They were a miracle. "They were wrong," he said, his voice harder than he intended. Winona looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It is their way," she said, a statement of fact, not of acceptance. But he saw the pain in her eyes, the profound wound of being rejected by everyone she had ever known. He saw her loneliness, and it was a mirror to his own. They were two outcasts, adrift in the vast, empty landscape, finding unexpected harbor in each other's presence. As the days bled into weeks, the cabin transformed. It was no longer a silent monument to grief. It was a home, noisy and messy, and vibrantly alive. The strict routines Isaac had built to keep his sorrow at bay crumbled, replaced by a new rhythm dictated by the needs of the twins. He found himself smiling, a strange and rusty motion of his facial muscles. He would watch Winona as she sang to the babies, her voice weaving stories of animal spirits and ancient heroes, and a warmth would spread through his chest, a feeling he had thought he would never experience again. He began to talk to her, not just about practical matters, but about himself. He told her about the ranch, about his dream of building it into something that would last. He spoke of the land, of his respect for its power and beauty. He never spoke of Mary. The subject was a locked door deep inside him, and he was not yet ready to open it. But Winona did not press. She was a patient, perceptive listener, and he had the sense that she understood far more than he said. One afternoon, she was mending one of his shirts, her stitches small and neat. She held it up. "You are a good man, Isaac Prescott," she said simply. The words, so direct and unadorned, struck him with surprising force. He just grunted in response, embarrassed, and turned his attention back to oiling a piece of harness. But her words stayed with him. He had not thought of himself as a good man in a very long time. He was just a man who survived. But looking at the scene before him, the fire crackling, the babies sleeping, this quiet, strong woman mending his clothes, wondered if perhaps she was right. Perhaps, buried under all the grief and bitterness, the man he was supposed to be was still there. Perhaps this strange, unexpected family, born of a blizzard and an act of desperation, was not just saving him from loneliness, perhaps it was saving his soul. The deep winter locked them in its icy grip. Snow piled in great drifts against the cabin, and the world outside the windows became a landscape of stark white and shadow. The isolation was absolute. No one could get in, and they could not get out. For some, it would have been a prison. For Isaac and Winona, it became a sanctuary. The small, warm cabin was their entire world, a haven against the howling ferocity of the elements. Inside its walls, their fragile, unspoken bond deepened. They developed a comfortable domesticity, a partnership that flowed with the natural grace of water finding its course. He chopped the wood that kept them warm, she cooked the food that kept them strong. He would return from tending the livestock covered in snow to find the cabin filled with the scent of stew and the soft sounds of the babies. She would look up and offer a small, quiet smile, and it was enough to thaw the chill from his bones. She named the twins. The boy she called Chaitan, the Lakota word for falcon, for the fierce spirit she saw in him. The girl she named Wachiwi, meaning dancer, for the way her little legs would kick and move as if to some unheard music. Isaac found himself using the names, rolling the unfamiliar syllables on his tongue until they became as natural as his own, Chaitan and Wachiwi. They were no longer just the babies, they were individuals, small people with nascent personalities. Chaitan was solemn and observant, his blue eyes taking in everything with a serious intensity. Wachiwi was bright and expressive, quick to smile and gurgle with delight. One evening, Isaac was carving a small wooden bird for Wachiwi, the shavings falling onto the hearth. Winona was humming a lullaby to Chaitan. The peace in the room was so profound, so complete, that it felt almost fragile, as if a single loud noise could shatter it. It was in that moment of quiet contentment that Isaac found the courage to unlock the door he had kept bolted for so long. "My wife," he began, his voice rough, startling them both. Her name was Mary. Winona stopped humming. She looked at him, her expression patient, inviting. She did not speak, simply waited for him to continue. She had eyes like theirs," he said, gesturing with the half-carved bird toward the sleeping twins. "The same blue. I never saw that color on anyone else. Until them." He swallowed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We were to have a son, but there were complications. The fever came. I lost them both." He stared into the fire, the flames blurring through a sudden film of tears. This cabin, it was supposed to be for them, for our family. After they were gone, it was just an empty box, full of silence. He had not spoken these words aloud to anyone. Saying them now felt like lancing a wound, a terrible, necessary pain. Winona rose and came to sit on the hearth near him. She did not touch him, did not offer platitudes. She simply sat with him in his sorrow, her presence a solid, comforting anchor in the storm of his memory. "The silence is gone now," she said softly after a long time. He looked at her strong, calm face illuminated by the firelight, and he knew she was right. The silence had been filled. It had been filled by the cries of infants, by the whisper of her songs, by the shared rhythm of their breathing in the night. The house was no longer an empty box. It was a home again, a different home than the one he had planned, a family stitched together from the scraps of broken lives, but a home nonetheless. A profound gratitude for this woman, for the children she had brought into his life, washed over him. It was a feeling so powerful it left him breathless. But the sanctuary of the winter could not last forever. As the snows began to recede with the first hints of a spring thaw, a new tension entered their lives. The world was returning. Isaac knew that their isolation was a fragile shield. The nearest town, Redemption, was a full day's ride away, a place of hard-bitten men and suspicious gossips. How would they react to his new family? To a white rancher, living with an Indian woman and her two strange blue-eyed children, prejudice was a currency as common as dirt on the frontier. An even more immediate threat loomed, however, a threat from Winona's past. One afternoon, as she stood in the doorway, looking out at the melting snow, Isaac saw a shadow cross her face. "They will come," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Who will come?" Isaac asked, though he already knew the answer. "My people, to see if the spirits have finished their work." Her eyes met his, and he saw fear in them for the first time since that first night. "There is a man, Kangi. He is a warrior. He wanted me for his wife. When I chose another, he was shamed. When my husband died of the coughing sickness, Kangi saw it as his chance, but I refused him again. The birth of my children, he used it. He stoked the people's fear. He said I had brought a curse upon our band. He will want to be sure the curse has been erased." Isaac's hand went instinctively to the Winchester rifle that rested on pegs above the mantelpiece. He was not a violent man, but the thought of anyone threatening Winona or the twins ignited a cold, protective fury in him. "This is your home now," he said, his voice low and steady. "This is their home. No one will harm you here." Her gaze softened with a gratitude that made his heart ache, but the fear remained. They were no longer just battling the elements. They were now set to face the judgment of men, and Isaac knew that could be a far colder and more brutal force than any winter storm. The fragile peace of their winter sanctuary was over. The world was coming for them. The confrontation came sooner than he expected. It was a grey, grim day in early March, the sky the color of lead, and the air still holding a deep chill. Isaac was splitting logs in the yard when he saw them. 4 riders cresting the low hill to the east. They were not cowboys or travelers. They were Lakota warriors, their figures stark and imposing against the dreary sky. They rode with a grim purpose, their horses moving at a steady, deliberate pace. Isaac's blood ran cold. He calmly set down his axe, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked into the cabin. Winona was by the window, her face pale. She was holding Wachiwi, clutching the baby to her chest as if to absorb her into her own body. "Stay inside, lock the door," Isaac commanded, his voice tight. He took the Winchester from its pegs, his movements fluid and practiced. He checked the action, feeling the familiar, reassuring weight of the rifle in his hands. "Isaac, no," Winona pleaded, her voice trembling. "Do not shed blood for us." "I won't start anything," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "But I will finish it if they try to harm you." He gave her a hard, quick look, a look that conveyed all the unspoken promises that had grown between them. Then he stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind him. He stood on the porch, the rifle held loosely at his side, not aimed, but ready. He was one man against four, but this was his land, this was his home. A fierce, primal possessiveness rose in him. He would not yield it. The riders stopped a respectful distance from the cabin. The one in the lead, a broad-shouldered man with a hard, unforgiving face, was clearly the leader. It had to be Cowboy. His eyes swept over Isaac, dismissing him, then fixed on the cabin door. "We have come for the woman," Cowboy called out in heavily accented English, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "She carries a curse. She must be returned to the spirits." "The woman is under my protection," Isaac replied, his voice calm and even, carrying easily in the still air. "She and her children are not cursed. They are guests in my home." Cowboy's lip curled in a sneer. "You shelter this impurity? The white man protects the stain in the blood. She does not belong here. She belongs to the earth." He was not speaking of murder, but of destiny, of a spiritual cleansing he felt duty, bound to see fulfilled. "The only impurity I see here is the hatred in your heart," Isaac said, his grip tightening on the rifle stock. "She was left to die. That is a coward's act, not a warrior's." A flicker of anger crossed Cowboy's face. He exchanged a look with the men beside him. They were tense, their hands resting near their own weapons. The air crackled with unspoken violence. It was a standoff, a fragile moment that could shatter into bloodshed with a single wrong move. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, the cabin door creaked open. Winona stepped out onto the porch. She had wrapped Chayton in his thickest furs and held him firmly in her arms. Her face was no longer pale with fear. It was set with a resolve that seemed carved from stone. She walked to the edge of the porch to stand beside Isaac, a silent, unshakable declaration of unity. "Cowboy," she said, her voice clear and strong, speaking in her own tongue. It was a voice Isaac had never heard before, filled with a ringing authority that commanded attention. The warriors straightened, their focus shifting entirely to her. "I am not a curse," she declared, her eyes locking with Cowboy's. "I am a mother. The spirits did not abandon me in the snow. They sent a protector. They did not judge my children. They sent a good man to give them shelter and warmth." She took a step forward, her gaze sweeping over the other men. "You speak of tradition, you speak of pure blood. But what tradition demands that a mother and her babies be left for the wolves? What purity is there in such cruelty? You followed a man blinded by his own pride. You allowed fear to make you weak." She lifted Chayton slightly, so they could all see him. The baby, roused by the cold air, opened his eyes. Those brilliant, impossible blue eyes stared out from his swaddling, calm and unafraid. He looked directly at Cowboy. "My children will live," Winona said, her voice dropping to a fierce, low intensity. "They will live because their mother is strong. They will live because a man with a brave heart chose kindness over judgment. This is my home now. This is my family. My life is here. I renounce the law that would have killed me. I renounce the judgment of men who have forgotten what it means to be human." A profound silence fell over the yard. The wind whispered through the bare branches of the cottonwoods. Cowboy stared at her, his hard face a mask of conflicting emotions. He saw before him not the shamed, cast-out woman he had condemned, but a leader, a matriarch defending her kin with a power greater than any weapon. He saw the healthy, blue-eyed child in her arms, a living refutation of his prophecy. He saw the white man standing beside her, not as a conqueror, but as a guardian, his rifle held ready, but his eyes fixed on Winona with an expression of pure, unadulterated respect. The foundation of his certainty, of his righteous anger, began to crumble. He had come expecting to find evidence of a curse fulfilled, perhaps a lonely man driven mad by ghosts. Instead, he found a family, strong and defiant. He had lost, not to the white man's gun, but to the woman's spirit. With a sharp, guttural sound of frustration and defeat, Cowboy wrenched his horse's head around. He looked at Winona one last time, a look of grudging, bitter respect in his eyes. Then, without another word, he spurred his horse and rode away, his men following like shadows behind him. They disappeared over the hill, swallowed by the grey landscape, leaving only silence in their wake. The immediate threat was gone. Isaac slowly lowered the rifle, the tension draining out of him, leaving him feeling weak-kneed. He looked at Winona. She was trembling slightly, the aftermath of her immense courage, but her head was held high. She turned to him, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears. He reached out, not thinking, and placed his hand on her arm, over the fabric of her sleeve. It was a simple gesture of support, of awe. "Winona," he started, but he had no words for what he felt. She leaned into his touch for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had just passed between them. Then she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and carried her son back into the warmth of the cabin, back to their home. The battle was over. They had won. In the days that followed, the last of the winter's ice melted from the land and from their hearts. The confrontation with Kangee had been a crucible, burning away the last vestiges of doubt and uncertainty. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a roof out of necessity. They were a unit, bound by a shared ordeal and a fierce, mutual respect. That evening, sitting by the fire, Isaac finally found the words he had been seeking. He looked at Winona as she rocked Wachiwi, her profile softened by the flickering light. "When I found you," he said quietly, "I was already dead. I was just too stubborn to lie down. This house was a tomb. I was a ghost." He looked around the cabin, at the cradle, at the small items of clothing drying by the fire, at the life that filled every corner. "You brought it all back. You and Chaitan and Wachiwi. You filled the silence." She looked up at him, a deep, gentle wisdom in her eyes. "And you, Isaac Prescott," she replied softly, "you gave us a world when ours had cast us out. We were all ghosts, I think, and we have brought each other back to life." Spring arrived in a rush of green. The prairie, so recently a desolate expanse of white, burst forth with new grass and wild flowers. The air grew soft and warm, filled with the scent of damp earth and the songs of meadowlarks. The transformation of the land was a reflection of the transformation within the walls of the small cabin. Isaac and Winona's life settled into a new rhythm, one of shared work and quiet joy. He taught her the ways of the ranch, how to read the clouds for rain, how to gauge the health of a calf. She, in turn, taught him things he never knew he needed to learn. She taught him the names of the prairie plants in her language, which were good for medicine and which for dye. She taught him patience, showing him how to sit in stillness and simply observe the world around him. They were building a life together, piece by piece, a mosaic of two different worlds, creating a new, beautiful pattern. The twins thrived. They grew from fragile infants into robust, curious toddlers. Chaitan, serious and watchful, followed Isaac everywhere, his small hand gripping Isaac's finger, his blue eyes studying everything his surrogate father did. Wachiwi, full of laughter and light, was her mother's shadow, chattering in a mix of English and Lakota words, her small body constantly in motion. One bright summer afternoon, Isaac stood on the porch, leaning against a post, watching them. Winona was in the meadow with the children, showing them a monarch butterfly that had landed on a milkweed plant. Wachiwi clapped her hands in delight, her laughter carrying on the warm breeze. Chaitan reached out a tentative finger to touch the butterfly's wing, his face a mask of intense concentration. Isaac watched the scene, a feeling of peace so profound it felt like a prayer settling over him. Winona looked up and caught his eye. She smiled, a radiant, open smile that reached deep inside him and healed the last of the old wounds. In that moment, he saw his entire future. It was not the future he had once planned with Mary, but it was a future filled with a love and contentment he had never imagined possible. He looked at his children, he thought, the word feeling completely right in his heart, and saw their eyes. He no longer saw the ghost of his dead wife. He no longer saw a painful reminder of his own loss. He saw Chaitan's fierce loyalty. He saw Wachiwi's boundless joy. He saw the living, breathing evidence of resilience, of hope, and of the incredible, unexpected ways a life could be rebuilt. The lonely cowboy had found the woman and her twins in a snowstorm, and in saving them, he had finally found his way home. His own blue eyes, reflected in theirs, were no longer haunted by the past, but filled with the brilliant light of the present.